Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my September wrap-up. This one is coming out a little bit late. I'm a little behind with my filming and everything. The semester has started for me, as I've said in multiple videos. I'm in grad school and my semester just started, so I'm getting back into the swing of balancing videos with my schoolwork, and I'm working as well, so sorry if it takes a little bit of time for me to get into a rhythm about it. So in September, I read 9 books, which I was quite pleased with. Half of those books, about half, were physical books, and then the other half were audiobooks, and then there's one book that I read like the first third of it, so I'll probably include that at the end. So I think that I am going to talk about my physical books first and then talk about the audiobooks after that, just to have this have a little bit of organization. So the first book that I read in September was A Big Ship at the Edge of the Universe by Alex White. This is a science fiction space opera type story. We have 2 main characters in this. The first is Nyla, who is like a professional race car driver, and the other is Boots, who is kind of a war refugee and war veteran who now makes like fake treasure maps and sells them to people. There is a larger conspiracy going on in the universe, I guess, that makes their paths cross. They end up on a ship that has a band of misfits who are a little bit outside the law, but they find out about this conspiracy. They're the only ones who really know about it, so they're the ones who have to deal with it. And Nyla ends up being kind of in the center of all of this. And while this is a science fiction story, it does have magic in it. It takes place in space. They're on spaceships. There's a lot of technology. There's like robots and AI and all of that, but all of their technology is powered by magic. And one of our main characters, Nyla, is what's called a mechanist, I believe, which is a special kind of magic where she can kind of psychically connect to technology. This story took me a little while to get into. The way it starts is very action-packed. It's very focused on establishing the world and really like sucking you into the action. It throws you into this world and just goes. And I think that for some people that could really appeal to them, but for me, since I'm more of a character-focused person, I didn't find that especially engaging as a beginning to a story. But after the first couple of chapters, the characters and the characters' personalities really kicked in, and we got to learn more about them and their backstories and relationships to each other. And then I got much more invested in it. I do wish the story had a little bit more about the characters than it did, but the characters that are in it are very good. So when there were things about the characters and their relationships, I loved it. I loved these characters, but I just wanted there to be more about them. I also found that while this was kind of action-packed, the main like plot line didn't really get going until like maybe 50% into the book. As I said, there's a larger conspiracy going on that these characters are getting sucked into, and we didn't really find out anything about this conspiracy until like 50% of the way into the book. And I think that in some ways that makes sense, because there were a lot of clues and bits and pieces of things that they were piecing together to figure out that there even was a conspiracy going on, because like no one goes up to you and be like, guess what? There's a conspiracy. But it just felt like it was a little too slow in that respect. There was lots of action, but not as much story as I wanted. Overall though, I did really enjoy this book, and as I said, I did really love the characters when we got more information about them. There is also a female-female romance in this book that I really liked, and again, I just wanted more of them. But I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and I actually recommended it to somebody, so I think that's saying something pretty good about it. Then the next few physical books that I read in September were actually all part of a trilogy, which is the Great Tree of Avalon trilogy by T.A. Barron. So the first book in this trilogy is The Great Tree of Avalon, Child of the Dark Prophecy. The second book is The Great Tree of Avalon, Shadows on the Stars. And the third book is The Great Tree of Avalon, The Eternal Flame. But this is a reread for me, as I mentioned. I read these quite a while ago. I think the first book came out in 2004, and I think that's when I first read it. And these are very nostalgic books for me. They take place in Avalon, which in this case is a giant tree, and all of the people live on the roots, and each root is like its own country. And they all kind of have elements associated with them. So there's wood root and air root and water root and shadow root and things like that. This story takes place after all of the events of Merlin and King Arthur, and Merlin has left Avalon for the last time, but he's kind of a legend within Avalon. And in the story we follow, it's multi-perspective. Our two main perspectives are Tamwin, at least I think that's how you say his name, who is a wilderness guide, and Ellie, who is an apprentice to become a priestess in the Society of the Whole, which is their religion in this world. This world has had a lot of wars and strife and dark times, literally, in its history. There was a prophecy that 2 children would be born in that year. One would be the true heir of Merlin, who would be the savior of all Avalon, and the other would be the child of the dark prophecy, who would destroy Avalon. And throughout the story, we're trying to figure out who is the true heir of Merlin, who is the child of the dark prophecy. Are any of the characters that we are following one of those prophesied children? And so this is a chosen one story. It is a quest to save a magical world, and it follows a lot of very classic fantasy type tropes. I loved rereading this. It's extremely nostalgic for me, especially the first book. While rereading it, I just immediately had this feeling of falling back into this world, and it was just such a wonderful feeling. I loved these so much. I don't know that I would love them as much if I was reading it for the first time now as an adult. Not because they aren't done well, just because the writing style isn't quite what I like anymore. The writing style is very plain and simple, very straightforward, and there isn't anything wrong with that. It's not poorly written. I just tend to not like that style of writing as much anymore, although when I first read these books, I really liked it. So, you know, it's just that my tastes have changed over time. I also think that as I have grown older and read more fantasy, these really like classic fantasy tropes of like the chosen one and these like kind of saving the world quests, they get a little old to me. But again, when I was younger reading it, I loved it, and those classic tropes really spoke to me. Another thing though that I do love about this series is that it covers a lot of concepts that make you think about the environment and our relationship as humanity to the environment and how we take care of it, our relationship to other humans and to other creatures, how we take care of and respect other beings. And I remember really loving those themes in it. It also talks a lot about the role of religion in society and how people can use religion to benefit people or creatures or beings or just the world, or how people can use religion for their own ends to hurt people or to control and things like that. And I think that that was also a theme that I thought was really interesting when I read this when I was younger, and I still think is a really interesting and important theme. So this is a series that I don't know if I would recommend to everyone. It kind of depends on how you feel about the writing style, for one thing, that it is a little bit more simple, and also how you feel about some of these more classic, more simplistic tropes in terms of the chosen one and that kind of storytelling. If you like that sort of thing, then I would recommend this series, and I think that it is really great, but it may not appeal to everybody. For this series, I gave the first book 4 out of 5 stars. I gave the second book 3 out of 5 stars. This is my least favorite of the series. It is the most like second book syndrome filler story kind of thing. And I gave the third book 3.5 out of 5 stars. So those are all of the physical books that I finished in September. Now moving on to the audiobooks. The first audiobook that I listened to in September was Gregor the Overlander, which is the first book in the Underland Chronicles by Suzanne Collins. Collins, who is the author of The Hunger Games. I really love The Hunger Games, and this series, The Underland Chronicles, is the only other series I think that she wrote, so I wanted to give it a try. It is a middle grade, I guess, story about a young boy who lives in New York City with his mom and his baby sister. His dad disappeared a couple of years ago, and then one day Gregor and his baby sister Boots fall into the Underland, which is a world underneath the city, and there are humans that live down there, but there are also giant talking cockroaches, bats, spiders, and rats that live down there, and they all have societies, and there are some who are allies and some who are not, and Gregor and Boots kind of get swept up into the politics and a quest in this Underland. There is actually a prophecy in the Underland as well, and the people think that Gregor might fulfill that prophecy and help their world. And while he's down there, he starts to learn that the Underland might be where his father disappeared to all those years ago. This story was just okay to me. I was not very invested in it. It actually was hard for me to finish the audiobook because I just didn't really care what was going to happen. I didn't really like the narrator. Again, this was a narrator that I felt that sometimes the inflection that he used in his voice didn't match the emotion that was written into the text of the book, which was kind of confusing sometimes. I didn't like the voices that he did for a lot of the characters, especially the voice that he did for the baby sister Boots, because he made her sound very creepy. I don't have a lot else to say about this book in particular. It was just fine, but not especially great, and I think I gave it maybe like 2.5 stars. The next audiobook that I listened to was Lyriel by Garth Nix. This is the second book in the Abhorsen series, and this is a series that follows necromancers, kind of. They're actually, the Abhorsen are people who have powers of necromancy, but they use those powers to combat necromancers. So in this world, their necromancers are evil, that they bring people back from the dead, and the Abhorsen are the few people, or I guess maybe there's only one Abhorsen at a time, who has the same powers as a necromancer, but uses those powers for good and uses those powers to keep people safe from the evil necromancers and the creatures that they bring back from the dead. Lyriel is a character who is actually one of the Claire, which are these kind of psychic people. They have the ability to see into the future, and Lyriel is actually only one of the Claire, because it is a power that is passed through generations, but she is the only one who does not have the power to see into the future, and so she feels very isolated and alone and very ashamed of herself. She finds a way to make her life there, and she starts to explore and learn more about magic. She actually gets a magical dog that comes with her on her adventures, and that was one thing that I really loved, that there is a magical talking dog. I always love great animal companions, and especially if we get to have animals that talk, always a plus to me. I actually really enjoyed Lyriel as a character. I liked her better actually than the main character in the first book. The first book is Sabriel and follows Sabriel. I liked the character of Lyriel more, and I think that the story had fewer issues with pacing and things like that. It is a multi-perspective book. It also follows the perspective of a prince, and the prince's perspective, I just didn't care at all about him. I just didn't matter. I really liked Lyriel, and I would have preferred to just have the whole book from her perspective. I understand for the purpose of the story why we needed the prince's perspective, but I just really wasn't interested in hearing about him. Although as much as I like Lyriel, she definitely isn't perfect. She makes a lot of stupid decisions sometimes, and definitely falls into those kind of mistakes where it's if you had asked for help or maybe told an adult or something like that at different points, then this would have all been fixed, but of course she didn't, and if she had, there probably wouldn't have been much of a story. So I did enjoy this book. I would put a warning on it for suicidal ideation and attempted suicide, but overall I gave this book a 3.75 out of 5 stars. Then the next audiobook that I listened to was The Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertalli. So in August I listened to Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda, and then I also listened to Leah on the Offbeat, both by Becky Albertalli, and so I wanted to listen to more of her books, and so that's how I ended up with The Upside of Unrequited, which is actually in the same like universe as Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda, even though I know they're contemporary and they all kind of take place in our world. But the character in The Upside of Unrequited is actually the cousin of Abby, one of the characters in Simon versus the Homo Sapien Agenda. So this is a story about a girl who has crushes on lots of people, or has had crushes on a lot of people over time, but has never really had a relationship. She never tells anyone except for her sister about all of her crushes. She has a twin sister who is gay, I think, and then they have their 2 moms, that one of the moms I think is bisexual and the other one I think is lesbian. Their family is Jewish. One of the moms is white and the other mom is black. So the twin sisters are white and their baby brother is half black. And so there's a lot of different diversity and representation just in this one family, and then also in some of the other side characters and friends that show up as well. I was really excited to read a book with Jewish characters and see that rep in it. One of the things that I was not as big a fan of in this story was just that this story reminded me a lot of Leah on the Offbeat. They're very similar in a lot of ways. The main characters are very similar. The main character in The Upside of Unrequited is less bitter, I think, than Leah, but they both have this very similar theme of that they are both girls who identify as fat, and that they both have this feeling that no one would ever be interested in them, no one would ever want to date them because they are fat, and so they kind of isolate themselves from people and don't have any relationships. I would have liked to see a little more diversity of experience, or diversity of just like storytelling. Maybe have one of them who's confident about it and one of them who is not as confident about it. I also thought that this book fell a little bit into that trope of like, oh, once she finds a boy who likes her, then she's suddenly like, all of my problems are solved. But I did overall enjoy the story. I think that Becky Albertalli does a really good job of like giving you that like butterflies kind of feeling along with the characters, which is why I enjoy listening to her books. Overall, I gave this one about 4 out of 5 stars. It was, again, one of those ones that's very lighthearted and fun to read, and it accomplished its goal of giving me that fun, like, butterflies excitement and, you know, enjoyment out of it. Then I listened to the audiobook of To All the Boys I Loved Before by Jenny Han, because I watched the movie just like everybody else pretty much and really loved it. It was so cute and I wanted to read the book or listen to the book. So I was very excited about this one, and it actually in a lot of ways has a very similar theme to The Upside of Unrequited, because it is about a girl who has crushes but never tells them about her crushes. She never has had a relationship because she never tells anyone or acts on her crushes. Instead, she writes letters to them and then hides the letters away. But one day the letters get out and her crushes find out that she likes them, and then, you know, craziness ensues and there is fake dating involved, and it's just adorable. Personally, I liked the movie better than the book. In the book, Peter Kavinsky, who's kind of the romantic interest, I didn't like him as much in the book. He is more arrogant and obnoxious, and you feel more like he just doesn't care. In the movie, he had more of a sweet kind of romantic feeling to him. He was more endearing. So I didn't like him as much in the book. I also felt like the relationship in the book was more one-sided, or more like Peter was kind of just using Lara Jean, and it just felt more unfair, and I didn't like that about it. But I did really like Lara Jean as a main character in the book. I like the balance that she has of being kind of shy, sometimes awkward, quiet, but then also in some aspects of her life being very confident and opinionated. She had a lot of personality, and she felt like a real person in that way. But I enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's another one that is, you know, a high school rom-com, and it's just sweet and fun, and I really enjoyed reading it. And the last audiobook that I listened to in September was Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon. So I was kind of on a bit of a YA kick for a bit, which is like very unusual for me. Although at this point I feel like I'm not gonna be reading or listening to any contemporary YA for a while because I kind of got my fill. It's not my usual, contemporary is not my usual genre. Anyway, Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon is about a girl. She can't really go anywhere because she's allergic to so many things that she could have bad reactions and possibly die if she leaves her house and goes somewhere that is not like decontaminated. And so she has lived most of her life in this one house, but then a boy moves in next door, and of course that sparks a relationship, that sparks new feelings, and it sparks a story. For this one, the story didn't really draw me in. I wasn't that invested in it. I also think that, again, this story has that feeling of like, oh, you find a boy who likes you and it just changes your life and saves you and everything's amazing because this boy likes you. And like I just don't like that trope. It just is not a compelling story to me. I also felt like that the story was trying to be kind of inspiring and this thing about like living life to the fullest and all of that, but really it ended up sounding like it was more putting down people who have chronic illnesses and having this attitude of like, well, if you're not living life the way everyone else does, then you're not really living. And if you are living your life in a way that you have to accommodate an illness or something like that, then you're not really living. And I just didn't like that theme. That really like rubbed me the wrong way. So those are all of the books that I completed in September. Then I started reading one other book, which was The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. I was reading it in physical copy, but the book is across the room and I don't want to get up to get it. But this is actually a reread for me. I read this series for the first time in the summer last year and I loved it. It's now one of my all-time favorite series and I wanted to reread it. So I started rereading the first book and I have been loving rereading it, and more about that book will be in my October wrap-up because I finished it in October. So that is all for my September wrap-up. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!